The letter wasn't meant for her eyes. She found it on a Tuesday, tucked into the lining of Cadden's coat. The coat she'd been mending for 3 days because she had nothing else to do in the pack house, while he attended council sessions she wasn't invited to. The needle slipped. Her fingers caught the folded edge. She thought it was a receipt, maybe a forgotten coin, and she pulled it free with the casual indifference of a woman who had long since learned to expect nothing surprising from her mate. She was wrong about that. The paper was thick, cream-colored, the kind they used for official correspondence in the Northern Territories. It had been folded 4 times with the precision of someone who wanted it to disappear, and the wax seal on the interior fold had already been broken and repressed. She realized, in a clumsy attempt to hide that it had ever been opened at all. The initials pressed into the old wax were not Cadden's. They were a crown over a crescent moon, and beneath the moon, 3 letters she recognized immediately even though she had never seen them up close before. A.K.E. Alpha King's Empire. Sira Voss stood in the middle of the packhouse mending room, coat draped over her arm, letter in her hand, and felt the floor do something strange and sideways beneath her feet. She read it. She read it twice. Then she folded it exactly as she'd found it, tucked it back into the lining, and set the coat over the back of the nearest chair with the same careful, unhurried movement she used for everything in this life. Because when you were the unclaimed mate of a pack beta, you learned early that your emotions were not your own. You learned to fold them, to tuck them away, to press them flat and hope no one noticed the broken seal. She went to bed. She lay there for 4 hours staring at the ceiling while her wolf paced circles in her chest. And in the morning, before Cadden returned from his overnight council meeting, she packed a single bag and walked out of the pack house into the autumn dark, and she did not look back. She had not chosen to be anyone's mate. It was not a thing you chose. The bond had come on her 19th birthday the way it came for most wolves, a scent in the air that was suddenly, inexplicably, devastatingly specific, a scent that had no right to smell like home because it belonged to a stranger. Cadden Marsh had been standing across the room at her mother's birthday gathering, a tall, sharp-jawed young beta who'd been assigned to escort the pack elder that evening, and when Sira's wolf had lurched toward him with the dumb, helpless certainty of a compass finding north, she had very nearly bitten her own tongue to keep from making a sound. He had felt it too. She'd seen it in the moment his eyes found hers, that flare of recognition, the slight stilling of his body, the way his jaw tightened as if he were bracing against something. Then he'd looked away. She had gone home that night and sat on her bed with her grandmother's ring turning on her finger and thought, well, that is going to be complicated. She had not been wrong. It had taken him 2 years to officially acknowledge her. 2 years of careful, courteous distance, of passing her in pack halls with a nod that held nothing, of attending pack functions with other females at his side while her wolf howled herself raw in the back of Sira's skull. The pack had noticed. Packs always noticed. The whispers had been gentle at first. Maybe he's just being careful, maybe he wants to be sure. And then they'd gotten less gentle, and eventually they'd stopped being whispered at all. He doesn't want her. He's waiting for something better. She's not strong enough for a beta's mate. Sira had heard all of it. She had a very good memory for things she was supposed to pretend she hadn't heard. She'd also developed, over the course of those 2 years, a comprehensive and detailed understanding of her own pack's structural biases toward female wolves of middle-tier bloodlines, and a second, quieter understanding that she had been staying small. Not from cowardice, she would not give herself that excuse, but from a kind of learned efficiency. In Colston, visible emotion was cost. Every time she'd shown something, frustration, hurt, the specific ache of watching your mate choose where to look and consistently not look at you, it had been noted, collected, and used as evidence that she was difficult, that she expected too much, that she didn't understand how these things worked. She'd gotten very good at not showing things. When Cadden finally came to her, 2 years and 3 months after their eyes had met across her mother's living room, he'd been formal about it. Polite. He'd explained that the bond was real, that he wasn't trying to deny it, that he wanted to do right by her. He'd said it in the voice of a man fulfilling an obligation, the same voice he used in PAC council sessions when reviewing resource allocations. Clear, measured, fundamentally uninterested in the emotional texture of what he was saying. She'd said yes because she was 21 and her wolf was exhausted from 2 years of grief, and she had told herself that courtesy was something, that duty was something, that she could build a life out of someone else's obligation if she had to. She'd been building it for 8 months when she found the letter. In those 8 months she had unpacked her belongings into 2 drawers of a shared chest because she didn't want to claim too much space. Learned which days he came home for dinner and which he didn't, and stopped cooking for 2 on the latter. Attended 12 PAC functions as Cadden Marsh's acknowledged mate and spoken to approximately the same people in the same corners, and been introduced by him with the same flat courtesy as everything else. Applied twice for an administrative role in the PAC records office, and been passed over both times for less qualified candidates without explanation. Stopped asking questions she wasn't going to get answers to. She would later understand, shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's obligation. That was over now. The road east out of Callston PAC territory was a dirt track through black pines, and it was 4 in the morning, and Sierra had 1,600 credits in a money belt under her shirt, her grandmother's silver ring on her right hand, and a very clear destination. She'd had time, lying awake those 4 hours, to read the letter again in her memory. She had a very good memory. The letter was from a PAC administrator in the Alpha King's empire, a woman named Drava, whose title was listed as Senior Coordinator of Border Integration, which was a very official way of saying she managed the PACs that had been absorbed into the empire's territory over the last decade. The letter was addressed to Cadden Marsh, Beta Designate, Callston PAC, and it was dated 6 weeks ago, and it said the following things. It said that his application for relocation to the Empire's Central Territory had been received and reviewed. It said that his proposed role as a mid-level administrative attaché in the Empire's Northern Division had been provisionally approved. It said that his case file, which included a sworn statement that he had no current mate bond of significance, had been forwarded to the Alpha King's personal counsel for final clearance. It said that once clearance was granted, he would be expected to present himself at the Empire's capital city within 30 days, unencumbered. No current mate bond of significance. That was the phrase that had done the floor's sideways thing. She'd read it 3 times to make sure she hadn't invented it. She had not invented it. The words were there, in blue ink, in a bureaucrat's neat administrative hand, and they meant that Cadden Marsh had sat across from an Empire official or a notary or someone with the authority to receive a sworn statement, and he had said, on record, under bond law, that the mate he'd spent 8 months pretending to want did not matter enough to count. She wasn't angry. That was the strange part. She'd expected to be angry, lying there in the dark waiting for a feeling that would make sense, and what came instead was something much quieter and much more dangerous. It was the feeling of a thing becoming clear. The 2 years of waiting, the formal acknowledgement, the obligation voiced yes, the 8 months of a relationship that had always felt like a duty roster. It all rearranged itself into a shape she could finally read properly, and the shape it made was very simple. He had never intended to stay. He had been waiting, not for her to become more, but for his exit to be arranged. She'd been the placeholder. Sierra walked through the black pines for 2 hours until she hit the main road, and then she walked another hour until the sky started going gray at the edges, and then she put out her thumb, and a trucker going east stopped and didn't ask questions, and she got in. She hadn't planned to go to the Empire. That had been a surprise even to her. She'd thought, lying in the dark, that she would go to her cousin's place in Harrow, a small, neutral territory township 3 hours away where no one would think to look for her. She'd thought she would disappear quietly, take herself out of the equation, let Cadden have his unencumbered exit without the complication of a mate making a scene. She was very aware that in Callston pack culture, not making a scene was considered a female wolf's primary social obligation. She had been not making scenes for 8 months. She had not made a scene the first time a pack function invitation arrived addressed only to Cadden. She had not made a scene when his best friend's mate had said, with the particular gentleness of cruelty that uses the word just, that she was just so patient with him. She had not made a scene at any of the 12 functions, or during the passed-over job applications, or in the 2 drawers worth of space she'd been given in a pack house that had 6 empty rooms. She had not made a scene, and she had been very, very good at it. And what had it gotten her? A letter addressed to someone else, the word insignificant. But somewhere between the second reading of the letter and the moment she'd stood up to pack her bag, something had shifted. A very small, very old part of her had made a very quiet decision, and the decision was this. If Cadden Marsh had filed a sworn statement with the Alpha King's Empire saying that she didn't matter, then she was going to go look at the Alpha King's Empire for herself. She wasn't sure what she planned to do when she got there. She told herself she was just going to see. She told herself it was curiosity, or spite, or some need to put a face to the machinery that had casually dismissed her in blue ink. She thought about her cousin's place in Harrow for about 11 minutes on the road out of town, the sensible option, the disappearing quietly option, and then she thought, no. She had been quietly disappearing her entire adult life and she was done with it. She told herself a lot of things on that eastbound truck, watching the pines thin out and the sky get lighter. The driver, a broad-shouldered older man who smelled of motor oil and river territory, and asked no questions beyond which way you heading, and accepted her answer of east with a nod and a thermos of coffee extended in her direction. She drank his coffee and watched the road, and her wolf listened to all of her rationalizations with the patient, knowing stillness of an animal who understood the truth and was willing to wait for the human half to catch up. The truth was simpler than any of her reasons. She was going because the bond in her chest, the one Cadden had called insignificant, had been pulling east for 8 months without her permission, and she had spent 8 months pulling back, and she was tired. Not tired of the pull, tired of pulling against it. She was going to stop pulling back and see where it took her. She tucked her grandmother's ring tighter on her right hand, the reaching hand, the choosing hand, and watched the territory change outside the truck window, and did not look back. The Empire's nearest border city was called Vethara, and it was nothing like Sira had expected. She'd expected something fortified, militaristic, the kind of place that looked like it wanted to remind you who was in charge. What she found instead was a city that moved the way rivers moved, with a constant, purposeful flow that had no single obvious source, full of wolves from a dozen different absorbed packs, all carrying the faint layered scent of allegiances old and new, all wearing the small silver thread in their clothing that marked Empire residency without being a uniform. It was the most cosmopolitan werewolf city she'd ever seen, which was not saying much because she'd grown up in Callston, and Callston had a population of 400, but still, it was something. She found a hostel 2 blocks from the central transport hub, and paid for 3 nights with a quarter of her cash, and sat on the narrow bed in her narrow room and looked at the ceiling and thought, now what? Her wolf had an opinion. Her wolf had been increasingly vocal since crossing the border, which was interesting, because the pull Sira had been suppressing for 8 months had shifted from a directional drag, always east, to something more specific. It was not east anymore. It was up. Which made no architectural sense until she went to the window and saw, 3 streets away, a building that rose 8 stories above everything else in the city. its upper floors lined with windows the color of old amber, and flying from its roof a banner with a crown over a crescent moon. aka the Alpha King's Empire Administrative Headquarters for the Northern Border Region. Sierra stood at her hostel window for a long time. Then she got out Cadden's letter, her letter now, she decided, and read it one more time. She found the name at the bottom, Drava, Senior Coordinator of Border Integration. She found a public directory terminal in the transport hub lobby and looked up Drava's office hours. Then she went back to her room, changed into the cleanest clothes she'd packed, and in the morning she walked into that amber-windowed building and asked to make an appointment. She had not expected to get one. The receptionist, a compact, gray-eyed woman who smelled of cedar pack and coffee, had looked at Sierra with the particular blank politeness of someone processing a request that required more explanation before it could be categorized, and Sierra had said, very clearly, "My name is Sierra Voss. I'm an unmated female from Colston Pack. I have information relevant to a pending Empire application that contains a sworn statement I believe to be fraudulent." The word fraudulent had done something interesting to the receptionist's blank politeness. She'd been given an appointment for the following morning. She'd spent that night in her narrow hostel room not sleeping again, but differently this time, not the hollow, sideways not sleeping of the night after the letter, but a cleaner kind, an alert kind. Her wolf had gone very still in the way wolves went still before a hunt, not tense but gathered, and Sierra had lain there in the gathering and thought about what she was actually doing. She was about to walk into an Empire administrative office and accuse her mate, her sworn, bonded, legally acknowledged mate, of filing a false statement with Imperial authorities. This was not a small thing. False statements to Imperial offices were a mid-level bond crime under Empire law. She'd looked it up on the directory terminal. The consequences ranged from fines to formal censure to mandatory pack reassignment depending on severity and intent. If Cadden's application was revoked, his planned relocation fell apart. If his planned relocation fell apart, he was stuck in Colston as a beta designate with a mate he'd tried to get rid of, which was, she examined this thought carefully, not a situation she actually wanted either. What she wanted was harder to name. She wanted the record corrected. She wanted the blue ink that said no current mate bond of significance struck through and replaced with the truth. Not because she wanted Cadden. She was increasingly certain in the clearest part of herself that she did not, but because the statement was false, and false things on official records had a weight to them that real things didn't, and she was not willing to be officially insignificant in Imperial archives. She fell asleep sometime around 3 in the morning, and when she woke, she felt strangely light. Drava was not what Sierra had pictured. She'd pictured a bureaucrat. What she got was a broad-shouldered woman in her mid-40s, who wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back with the practical severity of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that mattered and had no patience for the ones that didn't. She smelled of Iron Ridge Pack, old blood and deep mountain pine, and she had the kind of stillness that came not from submission, but from absolute confidence in her own authority. She looked at Sierra across her desk with eyes that had assessed a great many people, and were currently doing it again. "Sierra Voss," she said, "Colston Pack, you said you have evidence of a fraudulent statement in a pending application." "Yes." Sierra placed the letter on the desk. Drava picked it up, read it, set it down. Her expression didn't change. This was addressed to Cadden Marsh. "It was in his coat. I found it while mending." A pause. "You're his mate." "According to pack records, yes. According to the sworn statement in his application file, apparently not significantly." Something moved in Drava's eyes, not quite amusement, not quite sympathy, something between the two that was more useful than either. She turned to her desk terminal and typed something. Read the screen. Type something else. Read it again. "The application is still in clearance review," she said. It hasn't been finalized. I know. I'm asking you to add my existence to the file before it is. Drava looked at her for a long moment. You understand what this does to his application. I understand what his application did to me. Another pause, longer this time. Drava's hands rested flat on the desk in the deliberate way of someone choosing her next words with care. Miss Voss, can I ask you something outside the official scope of this meeting? You can ask. What are you planning to do after this? If his application is flagged and reviewed, and it will be, I'll tell you that plainly, where does that leave you? You've crossed 2 territories to be here. You're not carrying very much. Her eyes flicked to the single bag Sira had brought. And your scent suggests you haven't eaten today. Sira's chin went up by half an inch. I'll manage. I don't doubt it. Drava picked up the letter again and looked at it with the expression of someone looking at a problem that had a solution, but the solution was not obvious yet. Sit down, Miss Voss. I'm going to have someone bring you coffee, and I'm going to make a call, and you're going to tell me everything you know about Cadden Marsh's plans and timeline, and then we're going to discuss your options. I didn't come here for options. No, you came here for justice. Drava set the letter down with a small, precise movement. The options are what come after. What came after was stranger than Sira had prepared for. Drava's call lasted 11 minutes. Sira drank her coffee and looked out the amber windows at Vethara spread below, and listened to the portions of the call she could hear, which were limited to Drava's end, which consisted primarily of yes, confirmed, and I understand, interspersed with 2 longer pauses during which Drava's face went through a sequence of expressions that suggested the person on the other end was saying something interesting. When she hung up, she sat across from Sira with folded hands and said, "The Alpha King would like to see you." Sira put her coffee cup down very carefully. "Today," Drava added. "Within the hour if you're willing." "Why?" "Because the application you flagged isn't the only one like it we've received from Colston Pack this year, and the Alpha King has been looking for a way to address a pattern without triggering a formal diplomatic incident with Pack leadership, and you have just walked into this building carrying the cleanest piece of evidence we've seen in 6 months. Drava's voice was entirely professional. Her eyes, however, were the eyes of a woman who found the situation at least somewhat satisfying. Also, apparently, because he wants to. What does that mean? It means what it means. Drava stood. Will you come? Sira's wolf had gone very, very still. Not still like before a hunt. Still like a rival. Yes, Sira said and stood. She had time. In the car that took her from the administrative building to a separate structure she hadn't noticed before, older. Its stone worn smooth. Set apart from the city's flow behind a low wall of the same amber-colored stone as its windows, to have a small, private argument with herself. The pull was not east anymore, and it was not up. It was ahead. It had the specific, electric quality of a bond tightening toward its source, and that quality was impossible, because the only bond Sira had ever felt belonged to Cadden Marsh, and Cadden Marsh was 2 territories behind her, not ahead in an empire stronghold that smelled of old authority and deep-root pine. She was still arguing with herself when the car stopped. She was still arguing when the doors opened. She stopped arguing when she walked through them. The receiving hall was longer than it looked from outside, its ceiling vaulted in the old style, the stone a warm gray that held the afternoon light without throwing it back. It smelled of pine resin and old stone, and something she could not name, not incense, not the chemical fresh scent of modern buildings, something older and more specific, the way certain libraries smelled of accumulated thought. Her footsteps were quiet on the worn floor. The guard who'd escorted her from the car had paused at the entrance and closed the door behind her, leaving her alone in the hall, and her first instinct had been to turn around, the old packhouse instinct of a woman who had spent 8 months entering rooms she hadn't been invited to enter, and leaving them the same way. She didn't turn around. She stood in the middle of the hall and let her eyes adjust to the amber light, and let her wolf take the scent of the place and waited. The waiting was not long. The man standing at the far end of the receiving hall was tall, not in the rangy way of Colston Betas, but with the particular density of someone who had been carrying significant physical power for a very long time, and had learned to hold it with the easy unconsciousness of breath. He had dark hair, cut short, and the kind of angular jaw that looked like it had been placed there by someone who had specific intentions, and he was wearing plain clothes, dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, no insignia, nothing that marked him as anything except a man who smelled like deep mountain pine and old stone, and something she had no name for, and when he turned to face her, the world did the sideways thing again. Bigger this time, more thorough. His eyes found hers and stayed, and she felt her wolf go so quiet it was almost like silence, the way oceans went quiet in the deepest trenches, and she understood with a clarity that was almost violent that she had never felt the Cadden-Marsh bond. What she had felt for 2 years and 8 months, the east pole, the compass north certainty, the wolf pacing circles in her chest, had been this man. Had been him. Had always been him. He was watching her with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and was not sure how to arrange his face around the ending of the wait. Not shocked, not triumphant, something quieter and more careful, the way you handled something that had broken before and you were not certain yet whether it could be trusted to hold. "Siravas," he said. His voice was even. She'd expected alpha resonance, that subsonic command register she'd heard from her own pack alpha, and it was there underneath, the way bedrock was underneath soil. But the voice itself was quiet, almost careful. "I know what you did," he said, "and I want to tell you why it matters." She crossed her arms. Her heart was doing something she had no plans to dignify with acknowledgement. Her wolf was doing something else entirely. Something she could feel from the inside of her ribs, a kind of settling, like a creature finding the position it had been meant to hold all along. She had felt the mate bond recognition twice in her life, once across her mother's living room when a stranger's eyes had found hers, and once right now in this hall, and the difference between the two was the difference between a photocopy and the original. Everything she'd felt for Cadden in that first moment had been real enough in the way that reflections were real. It existed. It held the right shape. It showed you approximately the right thing. But it was light bouncing off something else. What she felt standing in this hall was light from the source. "You walked into an empire building," he said, "with a letter that was addressed to someone else to file a complaint on your own behalf, alone, with no legal representation, no pack backing, no resources, and nothing but the plain fact of what was true. Do you know how rarely anyone does that? I didn't do it for the empire." "I know." A pause. "You did it because you refuse to be filed under insignificant. Even when the person filing you doesn't think you'll notice." His jaw tightened slightly. "I noticed, for the record, across 2 territories." Sierra felt something move in her chest that she was not ready for. "What is your name?" she said, which was absurd because Drava had told her, because it was printed on the banner above the building she'd spent last night staring at, because it was the initials on the wax seal that had started all of this, but she wanted him to say it. She wanted to hear what it sounded like in his own voice. He said it. And her wolf, who had been pacing circles in her chest for 2 years and 8 months, lay down. His name was Cale Ashbourne, and he was the Alpha King, and he had been aware of the bond for 2 years and 3 months. He told her this sitting across from her at a table in a room that was smaller and less official than she'd expected. A working room, with actual paperwork on the actual table, a map of the Northern Territories pinned to one wall with various marks on it. She would later learn were tracking patterns of exactly the problem Cadden's application had been part of. There were 2 cups of water on the table, placed there before she'd arrived, and that small preparation, the deliberate before, told her something about the kind of man he was that all his careful stillness had not yet told her. He told her plainly, without decoration, in the same quiet voice he'd used in the hall, that he'd first felt the pull during a border inspection near Charleston 2 years and 3 months ago, that he'd had her identified within the day, not intrusively. He said quickly, a clarification that suggested he'd thought about how that sounded and wanted to be accurate, and then made the decision he now described as the worst decision of his adult life. I stepped back, he said. Why? A pause. He turned a pen over in his hands once, the first gesture she'd seen from him that wasn't completely controlled. Because you were unclaimed. Because you were 19. Because I had no idea whether the pull I felt was mutual or whether it was the bond going in one direction. A beat. Because the alpha king pursuing an unclaimed female from a border pack is a situation that has historically gone badly for the female, and I did not, he stopped, set the pen down. I did not want to be the thing that happened to you before you had the chance to choose. He said it flatly, factually, in the voice of a man reporting a decision he'd made and its consequences, not seeking absolution. And then 3 months later your beta initiated the claim, and a longer pause. I concluded I had made the right call. I told myself you'd found your match and I should leave it alone. And the east pole, she said. He looked at her. I've been pulling east for 2 years, she said. I thought it was Cadden. I spent 8 months in his pack house convinced the bond was there and just quiet, underdeveloped. I thought I was the problem. Something crossed his face that was not quite pain, but was adjacent to it. It was never him, she said, not a question. No. She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. It did not make her angry, oddly, not at him, not even at the situation. It made her tired in the way of someone who has been carrying the wrong map for a long journey and has just been handed the right one. Not angry at the map, just very much wanting to sit down. And Cadden's application, she said, was the 4th from Charleston Pack in 8 months, all of them with similar sworn statements. All of them part of a scheme by Charleston's Beta Council to place people strategically inside the Empire's administrative structure. His voice had gone entirely flat. I've been building a case. Your letter, his letter, the one you brought, is the clearest evidence I have of the false statement pattern, because it's the only one where the subject came forward herself. You were going to let the application sit until you had enough. Yes. And my mate, Cadden, he was going to walk into the Empire and you were going to watch him walk in, and I was going to be left in Charleston under a bond that was apparently one-directional. She kept her voice level. It took some work. That was the plan. A pause. The plan was made before I knew you existed as a specific person rather than a bond pull I was trying to ignore. It wasn't made with you in it, and that's... He stopped. He looked at the map on the wall for a moment and then back at her, and the expression he wore now was the one of a man who had spent 2 years being very controlled and was finding that position increasingly untenable. I should have come to you. 2 years ago. I should have come to you and told you what I felt and let you decide. That was the right thing, and I didn't do it, and you spent 2 years waiting for a man who was positioning himself to leave. And I'm aware of what that cost. Sierra looked at him for a long time. She was not a woman who forgave things quickly. She'd grown up in a pack that treated female wolves as a secondary resource. She'd waited 2 years for a mate who saw her as an obligation. And she had spent last night in a hostel room with 1,600 credits and a single bag, and she had walked into an official building alone and called a sworn statement fraudulent with nothing but the fact that it was true. She was not a woman who forgave things quickly, but she was also not a woman who ignored what was true when it was standing in front of her, being honest about itself. What happens to the case, she said. Cadden Marsh's application is flagged and referred for formal review. The other 3 applications under review will be held. The pattern gets investigated. A beat. Charleston Pack leadership, gets a very formal letter from my office. And to me, he looked at her steadily, that depends entirely on what you want. She turned that over. Her wolf was lying down with the deep, settled stillness of an animal that has reached the end of a very long run, and Sierra was, against all her intentions, beginning to feel the same. I want my existence on the official record, she said. Mate bond, full documentation. I don't care what it means for his application, that's his problem. But I want the record corrected. Done. And I want to understand what happened to Colston, all of it. Why they were placing people in the Empire, what they were planning. I'm from that pack. I deserve to know. He nodded. Not immediately, he considered it first, which she appreciated more than automatic agreement would have been. I can do that. And she stopped. And she looked at her hands for a moment, the silver ring on her right hand, her grandmother's ring worn for luck and stubbornness, not for sentiment, though it was both. Then she looked up. I need time, she said. I walked out of my mate's pack house with a bag and a letter, and I haven't slept properly in 2 days, and I've just been informed that the bond I thought I had was pointed in the wrong direction my entire adult life. I need time before anything else. Of course, no hesitation, no push. She studied his face, looking for the performance in it, the calculated patience, the alpha reading the room. She found none. What she found was a man who was extremely still in the way of someone who was afraid that any movement would break something fragile, and who had enough self-awareness to know it. I have a room in a hostel, she said. I paid for 3 nights. You're welcome to stay here instead. There's no agenda in that offer. There are 28 guest rooms in this building, and most of them are empty, and you are a citizen of territory I'm responsible for. The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. I'll stay in the hostel tonight, she said. I want to choose to come back. He nodded. Again, a real nod, not a performance. The nod of someone who understood why that sentence mattered. She stayed in the hostel that night. She slept 8 hours without waking, and when she woke, the first thing she noticed was that her wolf had not moved. Not pacing, not pulling, not circling. Just present, resting in the warm, heavy way of an animal that has found what it came looking for and is taking a moment to believe it. Sierra lay still and felt the strangeness of that, the absence of the pull, not the absence of the bond, not the numbness that had sometimes settled over her in the worst months of the Colston pack house, when she'd convinced herself that not feeling anything was a reasonable substitution for feeling the wrong thing. This was different. The pull was gone because it had arrived. The compass had stopped spinning because it was pointing at something solid, something real, something that knew it was being pointed at and was pointing back. She got up. She washed her face. She looked at herself in the narrow hostel mirror for the first time in days and took stock. Dark circles from 2 nights of bad sleep, a pale face that had been through something and knew it, eyes that were, to her slight surprise, clear. Not the slightly glazed clarity of shock or resignation, the clarity of decision. In the morning, she ate an actual breakfast at the Transit Hub Cafe, eggs, toast, the good heavy coffee of a city that had figured out what it was, and bought a new notebook at the supply stall next door and wrote in it for an hour. Not about Kale, not about Cadden, not about bonds or empire or fraudulent applications. She wrote about the pine trees along the Colston Road at 4 in the morning, and how the sky had looked going gray, and the particular feeling of the trucker stopping without questions, and the way Vethara had moved like a river when she'd first walked into it. She wrote about the moment she'd read the letter for the first time and how the floor had done that sideways thing, and how she'd put the coat over the chair with steady hands, and how she hadn't cried, not then, not walking out, not on the road. Not because she hadn't been hurt, because the hurt had a shape and shapes she could work with. She wrote about her grandmother's ring, and why she wore it on the right hand, not the left, not as a bonding symbol, but on the right, because her grandmother had said the right hand was the one that reached for things, and you kept your reaching hand free. She wrote, "I left because a letter told me I didn't matter. I stayed because I decided I did." She closed the notebook. She finished her coffee. She sat for a moment in the particular quality of a morning that is waiting for you to start it, feeling the city around her, and the amber stone building 2 streets away, and the banner moving in the early wind. Then she picked up her bag and walked back through the city to the amber-windowed building and its older, quieter companion beside it, and she knocked on the door. It opened. She walked in. The weeks that followed were not a romance. Not yet. They were something more complicated and more honest, a gradual process of 2 people who had been circling each other across 2 territories and 2 years learning to occupy the same room. He showed her the case files on Colston Pack, as he'd promised. She read every page. The picture they painted was ugly, a beta council that had been systematically building influence inside the Empire for 4 years, placing pack members in administrative roles, leaking information, planning to fracture a section of border territory. Cadden Marsh had been one of 12 approved placements. He hadn't known the full scope of it, the investigation suggested. He'd been recruited with the promise of advancement and told only what he needed to know, but his sworn statement was still false, and his application was revoked, and the formal investigation of Colston Pack leadership sent a very significant ripple through the Northern Territories. Sierra read all of it and felt the last of her obligation to that chapter close like a door. She asked on the 11th day whether she could see the original intake file on the Colston integration, not the current investigation, but the absorption 3 years ago. Cale had looked at her for a moment across the table they'd begun using as an informal working space. The working room had quietly become their room over the first 2 weeks, and neither of them had remarked on it and said yes, and had the files sent up from the archive. What she found was what she'd suspected. The integration had been handled carefully, even respectfully, by the Empire. Colston had come in with its autonomy mostly intact, with guaranteed representation on regional councils, with resource allocations that were, if anything, more generous than the Pack had been managing on its own. The Empire had done its part. What had gone wrong from inside, from a beta council that had looked at the terms and decided the fair deal wasn't good enough, that what they wanted was not protection or stability, but power, specifically the kind of power that came from infiltrating the structure that had absorbed them. They were never going to be satisfied, she said, closing the file. Cale looked up from his own papers. No. I grew up in that pack. I knew those council members. She turned the folder over in her hands. They weren't dissatisfied with the integration. They were dissatisfied that they weren't the ones running things. It's different. He watched her. I'm not saying that to excuse it, she said. I'm saying it because it means the approach for other pack absorptions needs to account for it. You can make the terms fair, and you should, but fairness doesn't neutralize ambition. You need better early signal detection. She paused. I could help with that. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. It was not agreement to her offer. It was the statement of someone who had known this for a while and had been waiting to see whether she would say it herself. She recognized it as such and was annoyed, and then, slowly, was not. You could have just asked me, she said. You needed to choose it, he said, not be recruited. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, that's going to be an infuriating habit. Probably, the corner of his mouth moved. You'll get used to it. She would, she thought. That was the surprising part. She already was. She was not in the case files herself, which she'd half expected. She was in Cale's personal correspondence, a separate archive entirely, marked private, which he showed her with the same considered honesty he'd used in every conversation they'd had. He'd written to himself about the bond, about his decision to step back, about the months of watching her assigned to a man he'd assessed in detail and found deeply lacking. The writing was spare, military, unsentimental. The feeling underneath it was not. "You were furious," she said, reading a particular entry. "I was, no softening of it, not at you. At myself, for the most part, and at him, for reasons that weren't entirely rational." "They were rational," she said. "He was filing claims with one hand and planning his exit with the other. That's not irrational to be angry about." "No, but I had no right to it." He paused. "I'd given up the right to it when I stepped back." She looked at him across the table. "You can be angry about something you don't have a right to. That's just called being human." "I'm not human." "Being a person, then." She turned a page. "You're allowed to feel things you haven't earned. You're just not allowed to act on them without the right." He was quiet for a moment. When she glanced up, he was watching her with the expression she'd begun to map, the one that happened when she said something he hadn't expected, which was often, more often than she thought it would be. He was not a man who was surprised easily, but she surprised him, and he did not try to hide it. She found she liked that. On the 9th day, she moved her bag from the hostel to the guest room. On the 14th day, she sat in on a briefing about border integration policy and asked 3 questions that caused the lead administrator to pause, recalculate, and request her presence at the next session. On the 15th day, Cale asked her what she'd been doing before the pack house. She told him, pack records clerk, census assistant. The quiet, invisible work of a woman who was good with documentation and had no obvious reason to be doing anything more visible. He'd listened with the same attention he gave everything, and she'd watched him absorb the picture of a woman who had been systematically underused for years and file it in the same place he'd filed Cadden's false statement, in the category of things that had been done incorrectly and required correction. He had not said anything about it immediately. He had, she would notice over the following days, begun routing specific pieces of border documentation through her desk with post-it notes attached, written in his spare, military hand, thoughts, or relevant to Colston's section, your read. It was not subtle. She did not point out that it was not subtle. She answered the notes, and the answers led to conversations, and the conversations led to her knowing more about the structure and pressure points of the empire's border policies than she had known about anything in her life that actually mattered. She was good at it. This did not surprise her. What surprised her was that someone had noticed. On the 21st day, she walked with Cale through the city at dusk, not saying anything for the first half hour, and he matched her pace and her silence without filling it, and she thought, this is what the East Pole was, not direction, not destination. This, the person who could walk beside you in the dark without needing to explain himself. On the 23rd day, she told him about her mother's birthday party, about the scent across the room, about the 2 years of wrong compass and the 8 months of pretending a duty roster was a home. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, I'm sorry it took this long. She said, I'm not sure it would have worked any other way. He looked at her. I needed to walk out on my own, she said. I needed to be the one who left, not the one who got left. I needed to find the building and make the appointment and say the word fraudulent out loud in an official context. She paused. If you'd come to me 2 years ago, I might have said yes, but I'd have always wondered whether I was coming to you or just going where the pole pointed. A long quiet. And now, he said. She looked at him, at the face she'd been learning for 3 weeks, the face that was increasingly, irreversibly specific, and said, Now I know the difference. There was a conversation on the 17th day that she had not expected. She'd been in the records room. Cale had given her access to the General Administrative Archive, which was either a gesture of trust or a test of what she'd do with it, and she decided to treat it as both, going through the documentation of the Colston integration from 3 years earlier, before the Beta Council's scheme had been identified. The records were meticulous. Meeting minutes, correspondence, census data, land assessments, resource allocation. The paperwork of an empire absorbing a small pack and doing it carefully, trying not to crush what it took in. She'd been there 2 hours when Drava appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, and the expression of someone who had decided to have a conversation they had technically been assigned to avoid. He turned down 3 potential mates in the last 2 years, Drava said, setting a cup at Sira's elbow and settling into the chair across the table. Just so you have the complete picture. Sira looked up from the records. You're telling me this voluntarily. I'm telling you this because you're the kind of person who will find out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it without the additional aggravation of having to dig for it. Drava wrapped both hands around her cup. 3. All of them appropriate matches by Empire standards, strong bloodlines, good standing, no political complications. He reviewed each file, met each candidate once and declined. Sira absorbed this. On what grounds? On the grounds that the bond was already spoken for. A pause. His words, not mine. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. An Alpha King has the right to decline without explanation. But it was noted. By you. By me. Drava's expression held something that in a different person might have been satisfaction, and in her was more precisely the pleasure of a pattern confirmed. I've been coordinating border integration for 11 years. I have processed more pack absorptions, more bond disputes, more false statements and legitimate ones than most people in this empire. I know what a man who has been holding still for a long time looks like. She picked up her cup. I also know what a woman who has been pulling in the wrong direction looks like, and when you walked into my office and said the word fraudulent, I knew exactly what kind of morning it was going to be. Sira was quiet for a moment. Outside the records room window, the city moved in its river current way, afternoon light warm on the amber stone. You called him before you'd even decided whether my complaint was legitimate, she said. Your complaint was clearly legitimate. That took approximately 90 seconds. A small, precise movement of Drava's cup. The call took longer. What did he say? When you called. Drava looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had decided exactly how much to share. He said to bring you. He said it in the voice of a man who had been waiting to say it for 2 years and was trying very hard not to say it loudly. Sira almost laughed. It surprised her, the laugh wanting to come, clean and genuine, from somewhere she hadn't felt anything clean and genuine for a long time. You're not what I expected, she said. No one is. Drava set down her cup. Neither are you. Most people who come to this office with legitimate grievances are frightened. You weren't frightened. I was frightened, Sira said. I just didn't have anything to lose. Drava considered this. That's not courage. I don't know what it is. She turned back to the records. But thank you for calling him. I didn't do it for you, Drava said, in the tone of someone who absolutely did. She stood, collected her cup, and was gone before Sira could say anything else. The formal documentation happened on a Thursday. It was nothing like the ceremony Sira had grown up watching in pack culture, the bonding rites, the formal announcements, the assembled pack standing witness. It was a single official record filed in the Empire archives, correcting the historical entry. The false statement struck through, the true one entered in its place. Mate bond declared and mutual. Sira Voss, formerly of Kalston Pack, now registered as an Empire citizen in her own right. Her own right. She'd read those words twice and felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but was somewhere cleanly between the two. Drava had handled the paperwork. She'd done it with exactly the same professional efficiency she brought to everything, with exactly the same glint of satisfaction in her eyes that she'd had the morning Sira first walked into her office, as though she'd understood from the beginning how this particular case was going to resolve, and had simply been waiting for the pieces to find their places. You know, Sira said, signing the last page, I think you knew. I knew nothing, Drava said, in the voice of someone who knew everything. Caden Marsh sent a message through official channels 3 weeks after the investigation began. It was formal, clipped, written in the careful language of someone who had consulted legal counsel, an acknowledgement that the bond had been improperly represented in his application, an expression of regret, a release of any bond claim. Sira read it once and filed it in the same place she kept all her paperwork, and did not read it again. She wrote back 2 sentences, noted, "Good luck with your placement." She was not cruel, she was also not sentimental. The evening the documentation was complete, Kale found her on the roof of the older building, watching Vethara's lights come on as the sun went down. The city spread below them in amber and silver, the same colors as the windows, and the river at its eastern edge caught the last light and threw it back. He stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. "I want to ask you something," she said finally. "Ask." She looked at the city, the river, the lights coming on one by one as the dark came down. "When I walked into Drava's building," she said, "before she called you, before all of it, did you know I was there?" A pause. "The pole changed," he said. "It had been east for 2 years. That morning it went specific." He glanced at her. "I knew you were in Vethara. I didn't know you'd walked into that building. But if I hadn't, I was going to come to you." His voice was even, unhurried, carrying the weight of something decided rather than something hoped. The Colston case was going to break open within the month regardless. I had been finding reasons to delay, telling myself it wasn't the right time. That morning I told myself it was the last delay. He paused. Then Drava called. Sira turned that over. "So we were both coming," she said. "Yes." "Separately?" "Yes." She almost smiled. "That's very us." He looked at her sideways, and she saw in his face something she had not seen yet, not the controlled stillness, not the careful consideration, but something younger and less armored and very much alive. The thing underneath the bedrock. "I think," he said, "that you are probably the most difficult person I have ever tried to approach." "I think," she said, "that you should have approached me 2 years ago." "I think you're right." "I know I'm right." She turned to face him, the last of the sunset at her back, the city below, the river catching fire. "But I forgive you for what it's worth." He was quiet. "It's worth a great deal," he said. His voice had the quality of something carefully meant. She reached out and took his hand. Not a grand gesture, just the practical, clear movement of a woman who had decided she was done waiting for things she'd already chosen. His fingers closed around hers. Below them, Vethara breathed its River City breath, and the banner with the crown and the crescent moon moved in the evening wind. And Sira Voss, who had walked out of one life with a bag and a letter, and a very clear sense of what was true, stood on the roof of the Alpha King's empire with her hand in the hand of the person the pole had always been pointing to, and felt the compass settle. Not east. Here. Finally, irreversibly, completely here. Later, much later, when the formal investigation of Colston Pack had resolved, and the 12 placement applications had been reviewed, and the border integration policy had been updated with a new early signal protocol that bore no official attribution, but that Drava referenced in her quarterly report as arising from consultation with regional staff. Sira would be asked, at a Pack Council reception, how she had come to be in the Empire. She had thought about the answer for a long moment, with the instinct she'd been training herself out of, the instinct to make it smaller, more incidental, less like a deliberate act and more like a thing that had simply happened to her. Then she'd said, "I found a letter that called me insignificant, and I decided it was wrong." The council member who'd asked had nodded slowly, with the expression of someone filing that answer away. And Sira had lifted her glass and looked out at the city, her city now, in the way that a place became yours not through birth or assignment, but through the specific act of choosing to stay, and thought of a trucker who asked no questions and a hostel room where she'd slept 8 hours and a notebook in her bag with 3 lines written in it. I left because a letter told me I didn't matter. I stayed because I decided I did. She wore the ring on her right hand still. She always would. The reaching hand, the choosing hand. The one that knew, even in the dark of a pack house at 4 in the morning with a letter and a single bag, exactly where it was going,